about our first webinar, so we hope that you'll give us a lot of feedback. It's a little different for me looking at a computer screen and not your faces, which I would like to be doing, but we hope that this works out well for you guys and fills up your lunch hour well. And hopefully you brought a bag lunch in and you can get out if you're in an hour and go back to work. We would appreciate some feedback. You will get a survey questionnaire immediately after the webinar, so please be very honest with us. We want this to go well, and we would love your suggestions. We are planning a 6-series webinar, all related to financial topics in 2015. Our thoughts so far are to repeat this one in February, so hopefully if some things don't go quite so well, you guys can get us back on track and we can try again. We are also planning to talk about how to set tuition rates. Along with that will be a discussion about the other things that you charge families in your school, and also discounts, which is a very important part of rate setting. We want to have a session dedicated to accounts receivable policy and also accounts receivable control. And we're planning one on how to value your company and how to make it more valuable. And so that leaves a couple of open slots. The world's changing quickly in our industry right now, as I'm sure you guys know. And so we'll be open to suggestions on topics that might be good for you. I would like to encourage everybody, please ask questions or make comments whenever you like. I always get my best information from participants. I'm just off of 4 conferences in the past 2 months, and I've gotten some great ideas there, which I'll pass along to you guys today. But please jump in if you want to just ask your questions as we go or make comments as we go. We can see those. I'll integrate those in with the discussion. There are 4 times during the discussion that I'd like to stop and take comments or questions and see if you guys have some good ideas that we might need to hear or some great questions. And then hopefully we'll have 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So please participate and jump in here and help each other out. I would like to start with one of my favorite, we all could write a book at this point, so friends that I've known in the industry and I talk a lot about when are we going to write that book, and every time we think we've thought of everything that can happen in our industry, there's another story for the book. So this is one of my favorite financial stories. I got my first start in childcare, not as an employee, but as a parent 31 years ago, which is scary to admit. But my then 2-year-old was at a childcare center, and I was an accountant, a young staff accountant in a public accounting firm, and so I know a lot about financial issues, right? I understand what companies earn, what they should be spending, and how they make their money. And so I would go in to pick her up every day, my little 2-year-old, and I would go into her classroom and I would count the heads in the classroom and multiply that by the $45 a week they were charging me in tuition. And for the life of me, could not understand why these people needed to make so much money off of me, because I was convinced they were making a fortune off that $45 a week. I'm sure if I asked the question right now, not many of you guys would go back to the days where we charged $45 a week for a 2- and a 3-year-old. But it did happen, and a year later after that experience, I was expecting my second child and was expected to work 60 hours a week still in my accounting firm. So I heard that my daughter's child care center was looking for someone to manage their books, and I went over to take what I expected at the time would just be a little year or 2 short job at this little daycare center, and I'll go back to public accounting. What I found out was that the picture was much different than I expected, as all of you guys know. It was a very fast-growing industry. It was exciting. The people who were in it were fantastic. They continue to be, which is what's kept me in this industry for 28 and a half years. So I ended up, instead of spending a year or two there, spent 18 years there. I moved from a financial role to an operational role, which is where most of the basis of this financial information comes from. At the time, I had to make a lot of it up because then and still today, there's not a lot of information in our industry about what companies should do financially, what they should be spending, how they should control their data. And so we did a lot of making it up as you go. So I moved from a financial role to an operations role, and then strictly an acquisition role. We grew that company from 5 to about 120 schools over my 18 years there. And then 12 years ago, I decided to bite the bullet and do my own thing and have started Strategic Solutions Group. Today, what we do most of is help people get their companies in great shape to have either acquire more schools or to sell their schools and have an exit event. And we want to work with them as far ahead as possible so that they're very profitable and they go out really big. So that's one of this webinar series is one of the things that we want to do toward that end. Today we cover the country with helping people buy and sell schools, and we have 4 people on staff, and there's more than we can keep up with right now because there's a lot of activity in our industry. So thanks again for being here. Let's jump right into the content, and I will keep an eye on questions. You guys feel free to get in there when you want. So what I'd like to do is start each webinar with a very quick state of what's going on in the industry globally. We talk on the phone all day, basically. We do a little traveling, but we basically talk to different people in the industry most every day. And so we get some good exposure to what's going on in the industry. And it's changing so quickly at the moment that I don't think trying to update this every other month is unreasonable. So you guys give me some feedback on whether this is useful information. But let me just tell you what we see going on in the industry, and this might go back toward the last year or so. In the last year or so, we have seen a real increase in values that people are paying for businesses and real estate. And so a business value is based on a multiple, and a real estate value is based on a cap rate. I could have just said increased value for businesses and real estate, but that's what that means. So never in our history, well, in my history of 28 and a half years, have I seen values where they are right now. A lot of the reason for that is that pre-2009 and 10, when the world was not doing real well, there wasn't a tremendous amount of interest in our industry. We weren't seen as a sophisticated industry. A couple of things happened that changed that. One thing that happened is that the private equity market started to find less places to put their money. The technology companies weren't doing as well as they did in the past, and they were looking for more stable industries. And even though you might be surprised to hear this, we were stable. So what most people experienced in 2009 and 10 was that they were about 10% down on the top line and about flat on the bottom line. And what that says is that even though we lost enrollment, we're great at managing our expenses, right? So you guys know that every Monday morning you need to know how many children in the classroom and how many teachers you need, and you need to make quick changes. So that's what we did, and it was very it worked, and the investment community noted that. The second thing that happened was there was a very successful public offering from Bright Horizons, and we love our friends at Bright Horizons. I think we've got 1 or 2 on the phone with us today, so we're glad to have you guys here. And they went out with a public offering that was very successful, and the world watched that and was happy about it. So those things helped improve the market greatly. The second thing, well, I talked about the private equity investment, but there's a lot of institutional money in our industry right now. So that's what that is. The franchises in our industry are the fastest growing segment of the industry. Just an interesting note there that they're growing faster than the private community. One of the things that we've seen that's been really interesting and surprising to us, because real estate work or investment in real estate in our industry pretty much shut down from 2009 to 2012. In 2013, we saw more people interested in buying real estate in our industry. Some of the other things that happened were, sorry, I've got to move something here, that they got more creative about what they're doing. And what I mean by that is that they'll buy real estate and they'll earmark money for capital improvements. So if someone has a building and they want to cash out of their building or have someone else own it, or they want to buy a school and they want someone else to own the real estate, they'll build in capital improvement funds. So, you know, if you're going to have a 15-year lease and 5 years from now you need a new roof, they'll build in that kind of funding. And the last thing is that where they were mainly interested in only larger companies in the past, now we've got some investment money that's happy with smaller companies as long as that site performance is strong. So those are the things that are happening in the industry. Hope that's helpful to you. And we will jump right into the meat of what are we going to do about that, all that now, and how are we going to get more financially fit. The first thing I always like to start with is that sometimes people believe that if they're working toward healthy financial control, that works at odds against quality. Logically, you would think if I have to cut costs, and that's what people usually think about, then that means I can't serve families and children as well. What I'd like to, you know, bring you around to a different way of thinking, that you really can't have one without the other. That there's really no way to not be a good steward of parents' money and have quality programming at the same time. So I've always felt very strongly about the fact that parents are paying you, you know, in most places a good bit of money for what they make, and that it's our responsibility to be good stewards of that money, that we don't waste that money, that we spend it on things that make a difference and not things that don't make a difference, and that we know that if we spend correctly in the right categories, that also means that the company can be profitable. And believe it or not, there are benefits to everyone in the school, but if the center is profitable, not just the owners. So I have a little bit of information about that at the end. But the message here is that you absolutely have to do both. You can't be quality without being frugal with money, and you can't be financially healthy without quality programming, because you won't have any children. So I always like to start with that. Okay, so here's the big deal. I hope that you guys got and I apologize for not sending this out a little sooner. About 2 hours ago, Reagan sent out a spreadsheet that I'll be referring to. If you don't have it, don't worry about it. Most of that information is embedded in this PowerPoint presentation, so we'll talk about it. If you do have it and you have it printed out, it could be useful, but print it out later. We're also happy to send this to people in an Excel format so that you can put your own numbers in, and the expense fields will populate. So it's built so that if you put in your school's license capacity and 3-year-old tuition rate and tuition income and rent, the rest of the expense fields will populate. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But the key, if you look at it, is that without the top line, you can't get your expenses in control in a healthy way. So if we think about it this way, if you don't have a healthy enrollment, your staffing costs will never be able to meet the percentages that I'm going to talk about today, because you're going to have a teacher in every classroom to enroll. you can't really combine too many classrooms on a long-term basis and expect that parents will be happy with that situation and will enroll. So unless most people set their financial situation up, or they should, what we find that people should do as they're building their school or they're opening a school is that they should be able to break even at about a 50% occupancy. And when I say occupancy, I usually use FTEs, full-time equivalents, where if a child is full-time, they would be a 1, and if they're part-time, they would be a half. And, you know, if you have 50 full-time and 50 part-time children, then your FTEs are 75. And just compare that with your licensed capacity to know how full you are. But at 50%, your school should be able to break even. If it can't, what we typically see is that something's off in either the rent or what they paid for the building. We're going to talk about that again in just a minute. So what I like to see is the possibility to break even at 50%. I like to see the possibility of a 10% bottom line at 60%. And what you'll see with this financial pro forma that I use as a baseline, because I consider this to be financially healthy, at a 70% occupancy, you should be able to make a 15% bottom line. So that's where I like to see. We get a lot of contact from people who aren't performing, and what we find out is that they were really going to struggle because either they spent more on the building than they should have, or they're in a tuition rate market where they can't charge as much as they should, or they won't charge as much as they should, and I'm going to get on that soapbox in just a minute too. But the point here is that you have to be well enrolled. We're going to talk a little bit about growing the top line here. That's not the intent of this. There are some great resources out in the industry right now on enrollment and marketing. I'm happy to give some of those resources to people if that's of interest to you. But I just want to share a couple of ideas here before we get into the expense side on things that I've been hearing that I think are working for people on growing the top line. The first thing is marketing has completely changed. So marketing and advertising completely changed in our industry from the day that I got started, and what we did was pay for Yellow Page ads. And I do know that some of you go back that far because you were there with me when we were doing that. The good news is that marketing and advertising are now more effective and less expensive than ever before. Today's parents are finding you on your website. If you don't have a website, and a great one, that's a good investment. Spend a couple of $1,000s and be sure you get that. Other ideas are to go through some web-based applications. I've been hearing a good bit about Yelp recently, Y-E-L-P, Yelp, which is an application on your phone that you can download for free. You can search for anything. I use it when I travel to search for things like banks and restaurants and whatever else I need. But I understand that a lot of families are searching for childcare on Yelp, and the good thing about Yelp is that you can get reviews. So they're looking at the reviews and what people, you should get, download it just to see if you're on Yelp and, whether if you pull yourself up, if there are any reviews. But you can also connect with Yelp and pay, and I don't think it's real expensive for you to come up at the top of the search when people are in your area and they Yelp for childcare. So I know a lot of people who are now saying that that's the #1 way that they get enrollments. And they're also asking parents, if they don't go out and say to their parents, please go to Yelp and write something about us, but if a parent says, thank you for so-and-so, it was really great, they would say to that parent, would you consider letting me use that on my website, or would you post it on Yelp? And parents are typically happy to do that. So you have to be a little proactive about trying to build that base of information on Yelp. The second thing I want to talk about is that there's some great information in there about what happens between the time that you get a phone call inquiry and the time that you enroll. One of the things I do a lot of is secret shop schools as I'm out. That's one of the ways that we evaluate schools in competition as we're possibly listing something. And I can count on one hand the number of really awesome tours I've ever gotten. And a tour is free, and it's so powerful. And so there's some great information there about how to handle the tour, the fact that you want to go into the classroom and the teacher needs to at least say hello and engage. I think it's great when the owner or the director says something nice about the teacher. That accomplishes two things. One thing, the teacher gets some great recognition, which they have very little of. And the second thing is the parent hears, or the potential parent hears this information about the teacher. So there's some things to do there in your marketing that I think I'm excited about in our industry. I think they're fresh and new. And again, if you want some specific resources, reach out and I'll refer you into some information. Some other thoughts are, one thing I hear a lot, I hear people get stuck in the things that they're doing, the age groups that they're serving in their school. You know, things like we've got a waiting list in our 3s, but we've got this empty classroom. And they don't seem to want to be flexible when demand changes. I would encourage you to be as flexible as possible. Get your enrollment up. You can always change it back. But don't get stuck in, and I can only do this age group in this classroom. And I do realize that fire code prohibits some age groups in certain states and certain classrooms, but within reason, don't get stuck in just providing what you've always done. What programs are most profitable? I think this is intuitive, but I'll say it. Infants and toddlers are typically loss leaders unless you're in a rate market where you can charge what it actually costs to provide that care. I'm a believer in infant and toddler care because I think that it provides families. So, you know, you're going to get the siblings, and I think it really limits some people that will enroll if they have a baby and they don't want to go 2 places. So, but it is typically a loss leader. So if you're full, you want to limit those age groups and have a small group. Your core, of course, is your 3s and 4s, and of course we're all watching what's happening in the public schools and trying to be sure that doesn't erode that business. And then after school, if you provide after school care, of course, is the most profitable program. If you don't do that now and things are changing in your market, that might be something that you would consider. And then I'm not going to get on too much of a soapbox about these things because I could fill up the next couple of hours. I feel very strongly about that I don't need to know what you're charging in tuition rates. It isn't enough. And so I'll leave it there because I know how hard you guys work. And I've had way too many people recently say, I've waited 3 years for a rate increase, and do you think I'd need to do one now? Well, yeah, you do need to do one now. You really need to keep those going pretty regularly. I would always communicate those to parents with something exciting you're doing in the school. That's always good. But we're going to have a whole session on tuition rates and also other charges and discounts, which can really impact your revenue. There is an article on our website right now about that, so if you're interested in more information right now, you can find that on the website. Otherwise, that'll be a topic of discussion next time. So I would like to take a quick minute and see if anyone has a comment or a question about growing the top line. I don't see any questions typed in. Any comments? If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We'll call on you. Otherwise, we'll go right to what I'm sure you'll be really excited to talk about, staffing costs. Okay, so I used to tell my directors that, you know, it gets overwhelming if you get a financial statement, you're looking at this financial statement, all these numbers, you know, you're trying to figure out where they come from, what you can do about each one. But if you manage your staff cost and your food cost well, you're 95% of the way there. So if you really focus on those two things, there are other things that can get out of whack, and, you know, you need to pay attention to those. But these are the main things to talk about. So this will be the most important discussion that we have right now, I think. Note that a couple of things to tell you about the numbers in the spreadsheet that I've given you. This spreadsheet actually got started about 22 years ago when a group of regional child care providers got together and shared information with each other. Like I mentioned, there's, you can get public information about Bright Horizons because they're publicly traded, but that's it in our industry. So there's not information out there that tells you what people spend. So I was very intent on building something that made sense and that we temper constantly. So we're privy to a lot of companies' financial statements, both people who have a single school all the way up to the national groups. And of course, we don't share any of that data. We're fanatical about confidentiality, but we do temper this spreadsheet constantly with that data. And it's very interesting to me that over the 22 years I've been working with this, only two numbers or two percentages have changed in those 22 years. And those are marketing, for the reason that I mentioned earlier, is getting less expensive, so that's good news for us. And recently in employee benefits, and that's mainly related to compliance with the Affordable Care Act. Talk about that again in a minute. But these numbers seem to be pretty timeless. So people, and their differences, every school's different, so don't expect that yours will look exactly like this. And we're always happy to look at individual numbers with people. But there's some very strong basics that if you get those things, your chances of financial health are much greater. So understaffing costs, let's talk about salaries for just a minute. So most schools will budget, and again, keep in mind that I'm talking about a school that's at least 60 to 70% enrolled, because again, it can be really challenging to meet these numbers if you're not. And also our model is built off of a freestanding school with with just center level expenses, with a market price director, and that are paid well for the market that they're in. So that's what this is based on. Most schools will spend between 42 to 45% of every dollar that parents pay for just salary. So we're just talking about pay. That would include regular pay, vacation pay, holiday pay, but just pay, no other benefits or expenses in there. What we usually see is if there's an issue with salaries and it's not an enrollment or occupancy issue, it's typically not the pay rates that they're paying teachers. There are exceptions to that, so it can happen, but it's not usually what I'm paying this teacher per hour or this director in salary that's the issue. The issue is usually wasted time. And so this is not something that you can fix once and it's going to go away. I'd like to say, it's like accounts receivable. You have to set up some standards and processes, and then it's a day-to-day, every 15 management process. So where the waste usually is I see a lot of overtime. So it just, overtime should be limited to emergency situations only. You're paying a person 1.5 times for every hour that they go over their full-time hours, and you could have had another staff. After a couple of hours, you could have had another staff member in there, or you could have paid somebody more money. So that's very wasteful to me. I don't like to see that except in extreme emergency situations. So really pay attention to that. I think the best way to manage your staffing regularly, and again on a 15-minute basis, is to train your teachers to do this for you. So, and what I mean by that is there are some good web-based applications out now that do that. Most of the people that I talk to feel like trying to input that data into a computer system is more trouble than it's worth, and that there's some manual ways of just keeping head counts that are more helpful. But if you want your teachers to know that when you get down to this number in your classroom, somebody needs to go home. And usually you'll have a volunteer. So usually you can say, does anybody want to go home? And everybody raises their hand. But if you're in a center where that's not the case, then I would suggest protecting your core team and your people who have been with you the longest. So protect longevity and protect your core team, and let newer people and part-timers and subs go home. But it takes that. And, you know, it's hard to do because you want people to get full hours, but for the overall financial health, it's absolutely necessary. So that's the most important thing that you can do. I'm going to run through these other staffing costs, and then I definitely want to take a minute and get some thoughts from you guys, because this is, again, the most important issue, and I know that you probably have some good ideas. I like to point out on payroll taxes that payroll taxes cost you about 10% of what you pay. So every time that you're over budget or overspending on salaries, you're spending another 10% over on just the payroll taxes associated with that. Employee benefits, like I said, this is varying greatly right now. Most smaller companies have historically used childcare benefits. So most will give free child care to directors and half-price child care to teachers, and that's what they can do. The companies that are larger are having to think about right now the Affordable Care Act and compliance with that if they're not already compliant. So I don't see this expense normalized yet. We're watching it. You know, we can give some information about what we're seeing, but it's so new and fluctuating so much from company to company right now that benefits vary real wildly based on that. Staff training, I like what I see here recently. So I've seen some great ideas and people doing things like this and webinars where they can get free training, and they can do it on a lunch hour. They can bring it in. They don't have to send people out to travel, or they have someone in-house that provides their training. So I love the creativity around staff training recently. And then there's always other costs associated with staff. You're always doing something nice for staff, and I love to see this, what I call miscellaneous category. Never bothers me when it's as high as possible, because any recognition or things that you can do for your staff are always a great idea for your school. So I'm going to stop right here. I have a couple of questions. Let me see what they are. Do you think that center should or should not offer a discount to staff members' child? Well, maybe we just address that. I'm a fan, so yes. I think that teachers are hard enough to get. I'll tell you some, I'm glad you asked this question. Two things. I am hearing people say that pay is more competitive with teachers now than ever before, and that teachers will go down the street for another $1 an hour. And it's getting really difficult to pay teachers what you need to keep them stable. I hope that staff recognition helps with that, and that, you know, there are ways you can make them feel so good about the team that they're a part of and what they're doing that you could minimize that. I don't think you could ever cut it out. So here is another thing that I'm hearing recently, because discounts can get out of control quickly, especially for your staff. I'm hearing some companies now limit the number, well, three things. So first of all, they might limit the age that can be discounted. So they might not limit infants and toddlers, because those age groups are expensive anyway. The second thing they might do is they might not discount, or they might limit the number of children an individual staff can discount. So they might let them discount 2, and that's all. And then the third child has to be full price. And then I'm saying, and this is really interesting, a lot of schools are now limiting the number of staff children that the school can discount. And I see the reason for that. I know it makes it really challenging when you want to hire, and you know, you really need to get that great teacher. But a good number is 5, and I see people go up to 7, or you know, you get close to 10, and you've got a classroom and a half there of discounted children, so it makes it really tough. So they might still hire someone with a child, but they might just explain to them that there are 5 slots in the school for discounted children. If one opens up, you'll be the first one in line, but right now I don't have that to offer. So, but I do think that most people do discount staff children, and it would be tough to be competitive without that. So any other questions or comments on staffing costs? Thank you for that question. All right, now we'll move to programming costs. So you'll notice that I've taken a little liberty in what I call a programming cost, and you know, there's some differences in the way people like to present their numbers, but I'll show you the way that I do it because I know what numbers should be, and it's easy for me to pick out things that might be an issue. So second biggest variable expense that you have control over are your food costs. I typically see people here in the 5 to 6% range, closer to 6% if they're on the USDA food program, and of course the food program encourages waste because you have to use portion sizes that are too big for the children, and you have to throw away a lot of milk. So I hate that about it, but what we usually see in food costs that might be wasteful if you're not on the food program is portion sizes. That would be my suggestion to take a look at. I see a lot of adult-sized portions on children's plates that end up in the trash. And not that you want children not to have what they want, but you can always add to it. So I think that would be the thing to look at there. Absolutely shop your vendor for food very regularly. I know there are other people that have had the experience of having a food vendor give you prices and then, you know, not noticing what was going on for a few months and then noticing that all the prices are higher now. So that's one thing to look at. Constantly bid that. It's much more important now than it used to be when you need to be controlling that. I see more people having parents bring food. I think that's something that you have to really start out with, though. It doesn't seem to go well in a transition. So for a new school, especially in more high-end markets, parents seem to even enjoy bringing the food. You know, they bring the little hummus and the vegetables, and it's almost a fun thing for the children to do. And so those schools will provide drinks and snacks, but will have parents bring in the food. Let's stop for a second because we've got a question about is food program reimbursement shown in tuition revenue or netted against food expenses here. So it's not shown here at all. I have just done tuition income and, you know, no food program revenue. What I say about that is if you are on the food program, most people would present that number separately on the top line so that you can see it and compare that with what you're spending on food. It's been my experience that you should be able to more than pay for your food, and it's intended that way because it's intended to cover some of the administrative cost as well. So it is administratively challenging, but definitely financially viable. So I would suggest that if you can participate in the food program, you do. Very creative idea. I heard from someone recently that they were just a few children away. And, you know, you want to be a few children over because you don't want to lose a child or two, do all that work, and then find out that you're not able to get reimbursed. But creative idea was that this school scholarshiped a couple of children. So what they got out of that was, you know, they either gave them a partial or a full scholarship, and they were eligible for the food program, so they were able to get that reimbursement. They used the scholarship as a marketing tool and got some publicity that way. So very, very interesting there. In addition to food, what I'll say about supplies is that, you know, again, other supplies bid this constantly. I think we talked a good bit about advertising. We do see that percentage going down now, but it's always people's instinct to cut back on advertising if they're not doing well, just because it's easy to cut back on, and you really have to think about that in a complete opposite way. When your enrollment's down, you need to just bite the bullet and spend more money in that category. Vehicle expense completely varies depending on whether you transport children. They're typically dues to associations. And what I like to say about field trips is be sure you break even on this expense. Build in the cost of your transportation, and if there's an admission charge, be sure you're covering the cost of your teachers or whoever's going on that trip. I like to either see those netted against each other in the same category on the financial statement, or show field trip revenue and the field trip expenses so you can track how well you're doing there. And then there's always something miscellaneous on programming. So again, if I have to have a miscellaneous category, that's where I want to see it. Any other questions or comments on programming costs? Okay, thank you. All right, let's talk about the facility. Like I mentioned, rent or what you spend on your building is where people get in trouble a lot. And you know, once they're in trouble, there are a couple of things you can do. So I'm encouraging people, a lot of people in the economic downturn went back to their landlords and said, you know, I'd like to renegotiate my rent. And there's several ways you can do that. And I encourage people, if they feel like they're over market rent, go back to your landlord. They would prefer to have less rent than no rent if you don't make it. In addition to the amount that you're paying for rent, there are other things you can do with them, though. You can also go back to them and renegotiate the escalators, or how much your rent's going to increase whenever it increases annually, every 5 years, whenever it increases. Maybe you cut those down some. Maybe you have the landlord be responsible for something they're not, like the property taxes or part of the insurance or part of the maintenance. But it's a good time. If you, again, we're happy to help people evaluate that. If you feel like your rent or your lease might be over market, that's something that you really can't ignore, because you're going to get yourself in more and more trouble. So good time to do that. Maintenance is kind of a trade-off with rent. So if you're in an older building, you might be spending even less than 12%. I mean, I've seen schools go down to 7 or 8%, but their maintenance is going to be higher. So there's typically a trade-off there. So you'll see repairs and maintenance vary depending on the age and condition of your building. Utilities, insurance, and I have put all insurance into this category: workers' comp, building. I don't typically, and liability, I don't typically separate those out, but if anybody's interested, I could certainly break it out and give you those numbers. Property taxes, of course, I hear anywhere from 6,000 to, I've had actually 60,000 recently in a certain area. It's practically another building payment, so those just vary depending on where you are. And telephone, of course. So other comments or questions about facility costs from anyone? Okay. So I'm going to fly real quickly through the next two slides, but I don't want to ignore the fact that the first one is there are always administrative costs associated with operating your company. Typical ones are business licenses, office supplies, postage, and travel. I've put credit card processing down at the bottom. Credit card processing has really jumped up as a major expense in some companies in the last couple of years, but it's one of those expenses that you have either zero or you have a good bit, depending on whether you accept credit cards and whether your parents are participating in that. I like that. I think making it an option for parents is good. You might want to consider the fees associated with it, though, because they can be big, and be sure that your tuition rates are covering that. The next one, we don't typically see these expenses on a center level financial, but I want to mention them for people who are owners and who have their own financial statements, because you will have overhead that are expenses that benefit the entire company, not just as individual sites. I don't want to ignore those. As I said, the financials that we've presented are center level financials. It would be everything that happens within an individual center. But outside of that, if you're a larger company, you may have area management. You may have upper level functions like payroll processing that you have to pay for. You could have outside services. You could have a team of other staff members that do things for you. So that varies real wildly depending on the size of the company and what you're trying to accomplish. What we see is that most companies will spend between 8 and 10 to 12. I might be as liberal as 12. And it varies depending on what kind of mode you're in. If you're in a real growth mode, it might be higher. Then you'll add a school or two and that percentage goes down. But I think if you could consider normalizing it about 8%, if you're not in a growth mode, that's a pretty good percentage to pay on overhead that's outside of the center level. So let me take a question here that I have before I go to the next. Technology, let's see, technology cost. Do you suggest a line item for this, or do you just include this in miscellaneous cost? Do you see this cost increasing significantly as technology becomes a bigger part of the center? Yeah, so I haven't seen anyone do I do see IT services on financial statements pulled out. Those are typically services to repair things and to maintain things. Most people will buy their technology and they own it, but there are some subscription services now that I really like, and I haven't looked into one close enough to recommend one to you, but some of the web-based systems that are used in the classroom to communicate with parents, they'll send photos, parents can ask questions, parents get the daily report. It's just a really nice communication tool, and it will also do some classroom management, like some cost control management. So I like those. Depending on the level that people choose to use those things, I'm just seeing that vary all over the place, but I do like those, and I think that you can justify some tuition rate increase based on those. That would be a great reason to me to go up a little more than you might ordinarily. So if you typically go up $5 a week, go up $8 a week and include that. If you've gotten behind in tuition rates, and I should have said this sooner with the tuition rate discussion, what you might want to consider is grandfathering, or go up the regular amount in current families if your standard's $5, and then bring new families in at a higher rate. It's certainly more difficult to administer when you have people at different rates, but if you've gotten pretty far behind, your expenses are definitely going up right now, especially in staff costs like we noted, and you need to catch up. You might want to consider doing that. It's easy to do in infants and toddlers, of course, because those parents are coming in new already. So let's talk a little bit about what financially healthy means. If we have agreed that it's a good idea and it means that the center can be even stronger, what it brings is full hours for staff. You're not going to staff and sending them home, especially for those staff that need their time and are dependent on it. You have less of the need to go send people home early and not get their time. Then you can afford to increase the pay for staff, and that goes a long way even if it's small. And a lot of people are overdue. I know, I'm hearing that from a lot of people. I haven't raised rates and I haven't been able to pay my staff more, and we're never going to be able to pay them enough, but a staff pay increase is always very nice. You can consider increased benefits, so maybe you get started in some kind of health benefit or some kind of insurance benefit that you can bring in and help them a little bit. It means more supplies. When your director and your owner are not, or you, if that's who you are, if you're not counting every penny and watching it every day, it's much easier to be sure that your school's well equipped and well supplied. You can program in improvements for your school. There's always something to be done. You always need new carpet or new paint or new tables and chairs, and it's much easier to do those things. Same thing with new equipment and new vehicles if that's a need for your school. So I will stop. I would love to see, to take your questions. If you have any, we'll raise your hand if you like. I do have a written question here, so I will answer that one if we're going to look for hands. I own my own building and start to improve in profits. Is it better to pay myself more rent or increase the owner's salary? How you, if you're an owner and you own your building, How you reward yourself is, yeah, I would leave that up to the CPA, really, and make that a tax decision. What benefits you more from a tax standpoint? Is it better to take more salary or more draws from your company or pay yourself more rent? All that's okay in the financial picture. And when we analyze people's numbers, if you were considering buying another company or you were considering selling your company, all of that is removed or normalized. So what you do to reward yourself personally doesn't affect the center level financials that the decision to buy or sell is based on. So all that's okay as long as it's documented. So you can pay yourself more money, you can pay yourself more rent, you can have the company pay for your phone and your car, and that's why people are in business, and that's one of the benefits of owning your own business. So I would make that decision based on whatever the tax consequence was. Thank you for that question. Be sure I'm seeing them all. Okay. I think I skipped one. Okay. Is it 6% with the food program income included, or do you mean 6% straight cost and revenue on another line? So when I say 6%, if you're on the food program, my experience has been 6% just straight cost, not netted against the revenue that you would make from that. I would love for somebody who's on the food program to weigh in on it and tell me whether that's still reasonable. Based on the schools that I analyze regularly, it seems to be that 6% seems to be a good number if you're on the food program, and closer to 5% if you're not. Any comments or thoughts on that from anyone else? Okay. What percent should an owner be taking as pay, including draws and salary? As much as you possibly can, because I know how hard you're working. And again, what you pay yourself as an owner is completely irrelevant in your company valuation. It's completely ignored. So most people will draw out most of the money that their company makes. They will set aside some funds for future improvements, capital projects, vehicles, things like that, or future growth. So, what you pay yourself is really does not have a bearing on the value of your company. So most people will draw out most of the excess cash that their company makes. Our salary cost is closer to 55%. We're at 73 capacity now. How would you suggest lowering our salary cost? Good question. Not knowing any more than I do, I would point to two things immediately if you ask me to look at your numbers. The first thing is your tuition rate high enough to cover your expenses? You may be in a market where you have to pay teachers a certain amount to be competitive, and your tuition rate may not be high enough to match that. So I would, I'd love to look at that with you individually and give you an opinion of that. The second thing would be to look at early mornings, late afternoons. Can you get people on the clock later in the morning? Can you get them off the clock earlier in the afternoon? Be sure you're not using overtime unless it's an emergency. Those are the typical things that we see. You always want to look, you do want to look at individual pay rates, but that would be the last thing that I would look at. I just don't usually see waste there. So in order of tuition rates, combinations are getting people on and off the clock earlier and later, and eliminating overtime. And I know there's some other experts on this call. You guys are just being shy and not wanting to raise your hand. You're welcome. Anyone else got a better answer than that, or a different answer than that? Okay. Any more questions? Because you have about 4 minutes to finish your sandwich. Get back in there with your children. I got another question. Have you seen notable benefits while offering before care for students? Yeah, that's a tough one, really. If you're going to do an after-school program, then most people will, well, not most, maybe about half the people I see will also do before care and will transport children to school. It's really tough to charge what you need to make that before care worth it. What I'll typically see a pretty strong after-school rate, and you can do that and make good money there. Most people add on about $10 to $20 a week to do before care, and to make it viable, you need to be there an hour or two before school opens, and so you have additional staff, then you're using your vehicle and you're transporting children. So if I really thought through that, I think that if it didn't limit your ability to get the after-school care and you could not do the before-school care, probably from a financial standpoint, it's not a great benefit. I would think that it's probably a parent service or a good way to get the after-schoolers, but probably not financially helpful. We usually require a minimum children to offer the service. Okay, great idea. Thank you for that. So if you're going to offer before care, you want to be sure that you have a certain number of children in total, maybe, or going to a certain school, or you don't want to have one child, you don't have 6 children and they go to 6 different schools. That would probably be a challenge. So thank you for that comment. Other questions? Great timing. Thanks very much. I appreciate everybody being here. Please give us some constructive feedback for the survey, and enjoy your week. If there are any individual questions, anything that we can look at that relates to your school specifically, we'd be more than happy to do that. Check our website for the schedule and to sign up. It'll be ready January 1st, and we'd love to have you participate with us again in 2015.